Hello everyone. Happy birthday, Danone. Feliz cumpleaños. Es un gran placer estar aquí con ustedes para celebrar estos días. I'll switch to English, but really a great pleasure and honor to be here with Danone, and really appreciate the talks that we had today, which were about, I think, some of the new innovations that might come with food. And I think we saw some really different examples of what that might look like. So what we want to do today is, the title went away, but so what we want to do today is to really focus on what do the next 100 years of food look like. And I'm a scientist, an environmental scientist. I work with farmers, I work with nutritionists, I work with conservation biologists. And one of the things that we really have become preoccupied about is the extent to which food is failing us in terms of environmental health, in terms of human health. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. And really this critical need, and I think Linda captured this quite well, this critical need for alignment in the food system that allows us to understand which direction we need to go. So with that, the Lancet Commission was born, and its primary intent, as Peter Bacher at the World Business Council likes to say, is to provide the 2 degrees for food. Can we provide clear science targets that will allow different actors in the food system to understand what direction to go, to test innovation, and also to be able to understand what their contribution is to really a purpose-driven future. So I unfortunately start with a lot of doom and gloom, and I think this is really important, that we need to understand the absolute enormity of the problem, the absolute urgency of the problem, and the critical need for us to really make progress. I disagree a bit with Mike. Generation Z will not solve this. By the time Generation Z becomes adults, it's too late. We need to be bending these curves over the next 2 decades. So we've now entered what scientists like myself, Johan Rockström, and others call the Anthropocene. Anthropocene because humanity has become the #1 driver of environmental change globally. And what that also means is that we've shifted from environmental problems, which are local, to now environmental problems that we can measure and account for on a planetary scale. So we have planetary impact with decisions that we've made. And that really, I think, again, speaks to the magnitude of the issue, the magnitude of the opportunity. I like to use this figure just to kind of make that case. So in the upper left-hand side, we have ozone, and we've bent the curve on ozone. So in the 1960s, 70s, we realized collectively that we're having tremendous impact on ozone depletion. We got together collaboratively, governments, private sector, civil society, and we bent the curve on ozone. We no longer talk about ozone as a major environmental driver globally. This is an example of the collective action required in the face of these issues. What I want to emphasize with that, however, is that we're not bending the curves on other environmental drivers, and not just climate change, but we continue to see precipitous drop availability of fresh water globally. We talked about Cape Town, Rome, Los Angeles earlier, cities who now are preoccupied about ensuring sufficient water quantity. 80% of our fresh water utilization is for food production. Marine fisheries are beginning to show signs of important collapse. We need to bend the curve on marine fisheries, restore them, and make sure that these ecosystems remain capable both of providing food, but also of protecting against climate. The second row on the left, eutrophication, a number of dead zones globally. In the 60s, we had minimal dead zones in coastal areas, contamination of coastal waters by nitrogen and phosphorus, leading to massive fish kill-offs in these regions. We're now talking about 600 dead zones appearing in coastal waters on an annual basis, primarily driven by the loss of nitrogen and phosphorus into freshwater systems. Again, 80% of that coming from food and food production, to the 20% coming from cities. The loss of tropical forests continues to decline at precipitous rates. Much of this is driven by land conversion for agriculture. These forests, these carbon-dense forests, are our #1 line of defense against climate change and our best bet for conserving biodiversity. We talk about, on the right, the 6th mass extinction globally. Other ones were created by climate change, were created by catastrophic meteoritic strikes. This one is caused by humanity. And biodiversity is not just charismatic species that we want to protect because of their inherent value, but this is really about our biome. You guys will talk about the microbiome, we'll talk about the soil biome. Biodiversity is the global biome, so it's about maintaining that system which allows this Earth system to operate. And we'll talk a bit more about that later. At the bottom, climate and carbon and climate change, 20 to 30% of greenhouse gases coming from agriculture. We were hoping that this curve was going to begin to bend last year. There was a year where it dipped. We're on the rise again. We absolutely have to bend this curve in the next 2 to 5 years if you want any chance of achieving the Paris Climate Agreement. And that's the middle one, a temperature change. We're now well on our way to 1 degree. If we're extremely proactive, 1.5 is an option, but 2 is the more likely option. And we're really beginning to see the real impact of climate change in many regions of Mozambique. Population here, this curve we're suspecting is going to begin to bend by 2050 at 10 billion. And this again has become, I think, a primary target for many of us. So food is fundamentally failing us in terms of environment. And we rapidly need to understand how we produce food, where we produce food, and what food we produce in order to bend these curves. Food, unfortunately, is failing us on health as well. And Emmanuel spoke to this, Linda spoke to this, but we realize that we still have 2 billion people who lack key micronutrients to iron and vitamin A. Much of this in conflict zones, but growingly people who are in climate conflict zones, Mozambique, Puerto Rico, all regions where food security is now threatened by change in climate. 1.5 million children who still are stunted, and an unacceptable 52 million children who are wasted. And as Andre spoke to this morning, this is irreversible. This is a permanent condition that affects their capacity to learn, grow, and be developed. We slowed down hunger quite significantly. We've had an upward blip over the past 2 years, again, driven by conflict and climate. What we're also seeing, however, is this rapid, enormous rise in number of people who are suffering from diseases of poor food. 2 billion adults globally, it's the same number that are hungry, who now suffer from obesity and overweight, who struggle to control their weight and who suffer from diseases related to diabetes, to cardiovascular disease, and other diseases related with poor consumption and overconsumption, and 41 million children. United States and Mexico, we're talking about 40% of the population that's obese. That's a pandemic, folks. That's not okay. This is not about fat shaming or individual behavior, but this is a social pandemic, and it's driven by our poor food consumption. So food is fundamentally failing us in terms of health as well. We've done a fantastic job about making sure that a reduced number of people are hungry. We produce more than enough food to feed the world, but we really struggle to make sure that there is sufficient access to healthy foods globally. So with that in mind, the main objective of the Lancet Commission was to see whether we could identify healthy diets, universal healthy dietary guidelines, and sustainable production practices. These are the two hard shells on our planetary Oreo. The creamy stuff in the middle is what we've been talking about in the first sessions, the decisions that we can make as individuals, as society, that allow us to bring food within what we call a safe operating space. So the first one is diet. And this is quality and quantity, right? So globally, we want to make sure that people have access to 2,500 calories per capita per day, recognizing that if we deviate either too far or too low, that these are where the dietary-related diseases come from. And then quality, which is the proportions of foods that are on your plate. So this is a universal dietary guideline, but it addresses Linda's fears of control in allowing for tremendous flexibility. So if you imagine that plate in front of you, it's 50% fruits and vegetables by volume, 30% of our calories coming from grains, primarily whole grains, reduced consumption for many of us in terms of starchy tubers, including in the African continent, because these are calorific, but they aren't nutritive. And then a much more moderate consumption of animal proteins. For dairy, we're talking about 0 to 500 grams of dairy per day. For meat, I prefer using weekly values. We're talking about 0 to 200 grams of beef, pork, or lamb per week, 0 to 400 grams of poultry per week, 0 to 700 grams of fish per week. So yes, you can be vegan and vegetarian and be healthy, reduce that dietary risk. Yes, you can be omnivore and reduce that dietary risk as well. Greater consumption of plant-based proteins, legumes, peas, amongst others. Switch towards unsaturated vegetable oils, and 0 to 30 grams of sugar per day. So this is a proportion and the quantity of food that we suggest, if we're able to move towards, would reduce 11 million premature adult deaths per year. And again, it's about choice. It's about flexibility. There's 30,000 edible plant species on this planet. We're consuming 150, with 4 of them that make up the majority of our diet. So there's plenty of room for exploration, innovation. Just as Mike said, food is coming to us and we're going to food. 30,000 species waiting to be discovered. And for those of us who live in Europe or the United States, yes, it is a reduction in animal protein consumption. When we look at what we're consuming compared to what we should be consuming, this is the global trend. And this will vary by region. So we have the same slide for different regions, but globally, overconsumption of red meat by 188%, overconsumption of starchy tubers and potatoes by 193%, 53% overconsumption of poultry, and underconsumption of the rest. And again, these overconsumption values vary very much by region. There's room to increase meat consumption in Africa and parts of South Asia. There's a significant need to reduce that consumption in North America and Europe. Universally, however, there's not one region on Earth that we're seeing as eating sufficient protective foods, fruits, nuts, vegetables, and whole grains. And there really needs to be a collective effort to increase the consumption of those foods in diets, again, as a primary driver of reducing premature dietary-related mortality. The second hard shell for the landscape mission was the environmental boundaries. And just like diet is a hard boundary, there's little we can do about our individual or collective need for amount and quality of food. We live in a planet that's biological. We move nutrients through that planet, much like we move nutrients throughout our body. But humans have significantly altered the stores of carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and water. Carbon, we're shifting carbon from fossil resources and biological sources into atmospheric and oceanic resources. We're disrupting biogeochemical flows globally, and that's what's driving many of the environmental concerns that we see today. The other two limits that we want to talk about are biodiversity and land. And when I talk about biodiversity, it's not just about, again, these charismatic species, but recognizing that biodiversity is both a store of these nutrients, but it's a regulator of these nutrients, and it's also a regulator of gene flow and environment. Biodiversity, if you want, is what drives global metabolism. And the more we disrupt biodiversity, the more we disrupt that global metabolism, and it's recognizing the inherent need to maintain biodiversity, both in protected areas, but also embedded within our food production systems. And land, recognizing that about 40% of land is currently under agriculture production, and the need to maintain a space for biodiversity off land and to maintain that land for climate mitigation. So just like we provided dietary guidelines for food, this is our menu of options, and these are the limits that we propose for food as well. So in order for food to be within a safe operating space, it's one, can we produce the foods that are recommended in the dietary guidelines? And can we change how we produce it, where we produce it, and what we produce it in order to bring food within these environmental limits? We estimate that food emits 5 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. We need to increase productivity for 2 billion more people by 2050. Our estimation is that we need to be able to increase food productivity without additional carbon dioxide emissions. Hopefully we can do it even with less, and some people hope or think that we might be able to bring agriculture to a negative. Cropland, 13 million square kilometers, 40% of land is allocated for food. The target we've set is zero land expansion. If we want to meet the Paris Climate Agreement, if you want to meet the biodiversity targets, which were clearly highlighted this week with the IPES report that was released in Paris, we really need to be able to produce more food, better food, but with zero land expansion. Otherwise, we don't achieve Paris and we don't achieve the biodiversity targets. For water, we set a limit of 2,500 cubic kilometers of water. This is a hard target to understand. It's highly geographic, but fundamentally it means maintaining about 30% environmental flows in basins. Nitrogen and phosphorus, we've proposed an application limit, but it fundamentally again means keeping less than 1 to 2.5 milligrams of nitrogen per liter and less than 50 to 100 milligrams of phosphorus per cubic meter. So it's a water pollution boundary that allows us to maintain aquatic systems within safe environmental limits. And finally, biodiversity, and this really is a critical one. Biodiversity, again, is about maintaining global metabolism to achieve the biodiversity targets, and this again was emphasized by the IPBES report released on Monday. We need to achieve the climate targets, we have to achieve the land targets, we have to achieve the pollution targets, and we have to better integrate biodiversity into production systems. So the biodiversity target is 50% land intact, which is what we have today, status quo, while maintaining at least 10% of land in agriculture for biodiversity, recognizing that pollination services, pest control services, soil carbon capture, improving water quality are all provided by biodiversity maintained in production landscapes. So let me conclude with 5 strategies that we think are really the opportunity space, the innovation space, and invitation for collaboration with all of you, with policy, and with civil society. So 1, commit and act on healthy diets. And again, Linda spoke to this as well. We have food policies and conservation policies and public health policies that are completely unaligned. We would not be able to produce the healthy diet today on land that is being asked for by public health. We need much greater alignment between these policies. In the city of Paris, their politique d'agroalimentation is a perfect example of a policy that talks about climate change, it talks about water quality, it talks about access to food, it talks about healthy food, and it talks about the impact on mitigating climate. Second, produce quality food. We estimate that if we want to produce a healthy diet by 2050, it's 0 increase in grains, it's 50 to 75% increase in fruit and vegetable production, and it's 150% increase in nut production. Again, we are not able to produce now the composition, the quality that public health is calling for in terms of meeting dietary guidelines. 3, make agriculture regenerative, and this is really an important one. There is no bigger opportunity for restoration than in agriculture. Yes, we can set land aside for conservation, but that's already land that is storing carbon. Our biggest opportunity is working with farmers, with the farming community, to ensure that not only are they capable of producing enough food, but they're producing quality food, that they're storing carbon, that they're making space for biodiversity, and that they're contributing to improving water quality. This is what regeneration is about. It's no longer enough to have an agriculture that just do no harm. It has to be a much more purpose-driven and proactive agriculture. 4, spare half for nature and share the rest, recognizing that we have to maintain at least 50% of our terrestrial biomes for nature, but we have to integrate biodiversity in production landscapes, both as a means of preserving biodiversity, allowing connectivity with climate change, but again, recognizing that biodiversity is the source of food and is our biggest support system for food production as well. And finally, having food waste and loss. So with that, what I really want to do is to urge all of you, to welcome all of you, and as Emmanuel said last night, to become partners in crime with us, to be partners in crime with the global community, to really help to launch, to engage in, and to start this great food revolution. There's a lot of the text and a lot of today which is about scary images, the urgency with me to act, but what we found in our work is that by shifting what we eat, by reducing food waste and loss, and by improving production practices, it's completely possible to, by 2050, protect human health through dietary changes and improvements, protect 20 million deaths per year, but also to do this within planetary boundaries, leaving a planet that is safe, prosperous, and sustainable for Generation Z. So with that, thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the conversation.